Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we dive deep into the lives of individuals whose journeys reveal the power of compassion, courage, and the pursuit of truth. Today, we share a gripping tale of a dedicated nurse fighting to clear her name, uncovering dark secrets that shake a family's foundation. Stay with us as we unravel a story of love, betrayal, and redemption. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting a golden glow through the ornate windows of the Foster mansion. Inside, the atmosphere was still and quiet, save for the gentle rustling of leaves outside and the soft, rhythmic breathing of Mrs. Margaret Foster, an 82-year-old woman whose life was now drawing to a close. In the spacious bedroom, the faint scent of lavender filled the air, a fragrance carefully chosen by Elizabeth Walker, the nurse who had devoted the last 3 years of her life to caring for Mrs. Foster. Elizabeth's hands were steady as she arranged the elderly woman's medications, her eyes soft with concern and affection. But the bond between Elizabeth and Mrs. Foster went far beyond that of a mere nurse and patient. Elizabeth had become a daughter to Mrs. Foster, a substitute for the woman's own biological daughter, Veronica, who had always kept her distance. It was during those quiet hours, when the two of them would share stories of love, life, and loss, that Elizabeth's devotion became clear. Mrs. Foster would often clasp Elizabeth's hand in her own, her frail fingers surprisingly strong as she whispered, "My dear, you are the daughter I never had." Elizabeth would smile, her heart full, knowing that in this aging woman, she had found something more precious than a paycheck or a mere profession, a relationship that transcended the boundaries of duty. It was a connection, one of deep empathy and understanding. And in those moments, Elizabeth felt something close to peace in the world that had long been filled with the harsh realities of her career. But the peace of that morning was shattered with the entrance of Veronica, Mrs. Foster's only daughter. Veronica's heels clicked sharply against the marble floors as she stormed into the room, a sharp contrast to the tenderness that had existed between mother and nurse. Her presence, cold and calculated, filled the space, bringing with it an air of unease. Veronica barely acknowledged Elizabeth as she swept into the room, her gaze fixed solely on her mother. She had not come to offer warmth, but to demand it. "I trust you're keeping up with the schedule, Elizabeth." Veronica's voice was cutting, almost mocking. "After all, my mother is paying you quite generously." Elizabeth's hands paused for a moment, the tension in the room palpable. She tried to keep her composure, but the undertone of Veronica's words was unmistakable. There was no genuine affection in Veronica's tone, only a deep, almost dismissive superiority. It was a reminder to Elizabeth of the stark contrast between herself and the Foster family. She was the help, after all, the hired nurse, not worthy of sharing in the family's wealth or love. But Mrs. Foster, despite her daughter's presence, only smiled faintly and closed her eyes, as if in silent protest. She had long grown weary of her daughter's presence, and Elizabeth could feel it in the air, the deep, unspoken tension between the two women. As Veronica stood there, arms crossed, scrutinizing her mother's condition, Elizabeth turned away to give them some privacy. But her mind was racing. Veronica's words lingered in the air like a poisoned dart. There was something darker brewing in this house, something beneath the surface that Elizabeth couldn't yet put her finger on. Later that day, Elizabeth couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her stomach. As she tended to the garden, preparing Mrs. Foster's afternoon tea, the lingering feeling of dread gnawed at her. There were whispers among the staff, hushed tones speaking of Veronica's greed, her obsession with securing the family fortune. It was an old story, one that had played out in countless families where the love for money trumped the love for family. Then, in the midst of her quiet thoughts, Elizabeth was summoned urgently back to the mansion. "Elizabeth, come quickly. Mrs. Foster is in distress." The voice rang out from the kitchen, panic evident in the words. Rushing back to the room, Elizabeth found Mrs. Foster in a state of agitation, her breathing labored, and her eyes unfocused. Veronica, ever the picture of indifference, sat idly by, flipping through a fashion magazine as if nothing were amiss. Elizabeth's concern deepened as she approached the bedside. Noticing something strange, the medications had been subtly rearranged. It was a small, almost imperceptible change, but one that was enough to make Elizabeth's heart race. "Veronica," Elizabeth said, her voice tight with concern. "Has anyone else been in this room while I was away? The medications, they've been tampered with." Veronica's eyes flicked up from her magazine, her expression one of practiced innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "I've been here with my mother, and nothing has changed. Maybe you're just overworked." But Elizabeth, seasoned by years of care, knew better. There was something wrong here, something deeper than simple carelessness. The subtle rearranging of medications, the strange smell of masculine perfume that lingered in the room, it all pointed to something much more sinister. That night, as Elizabeth worked through her duties, she could feel the weight of the secret conversations between Veronica and an unknown man. From the faint voices she overheard in the hallway, she pieced together a terrifying puzzle. Veronica was not just concerned with her mother's health. She was obsessed with securing her inheritance. Elizabeth's suspicions grew as she observed the faint changes in Mrs. Foster's condition. Her patient was deteriorating faster than expected, and Elizabeth began to suspect foul play. She had seen enough in her career to know when something was wrong. But what could she do? She was just a nurse, the outsider in a world of wealth and power. Her only weapon was her vigilance, her ability to observe and protect Mrs. Foster, no matter the cost. As the days passed, the unease only deepened. Veronica's behavior became increasingly erratic, and the tension in the mansion grew palpable. Elizabeth knew that she was walking a fine line between loyalty to her patient and the suffocating forces that sought to control Mrs. Foster's fortune. The more she observed, the more she realized that Veronica's motives were far darker than she had initially suspected. The woman she had once trusted to care for her elderly patient was, in fact, an orchestrator of a sinister plot. And so, as the light faded from the Foster mansion that evening, Elizabeth made a vow to herself and to Mrs. Foster. No matter the cost, she would protect her, even if it meant facing the terrifying truth of what Veronica had planned. But Elizabeth didn't yet know how deep the conspiracy went, or how her own life was about to be changed forever. The days grew heavier as Elizabeth's suspicions of Veronica's intentions deepened. The mansion, once a place of solace and sanctuary for Elizabeth, now felt like a suffocating labyrinth filled with whispers and hidden agendas. Veronica's behavior became increasingly erratic, her visits to her mother now fraught with tension. Elizabeth could sense the mounting pressure that hung in the air, a pressure that threatened to crush the fragile balance she had fought so hard to maintain. It wasn't just the subtle manipulations of Mrs. Foster's medication that unnerved Elizabeth. It was the cold, calculating conversations she overheard between Veronica and a mysterious man. Though the voices were hushed, Elizabeth could hear fragments of their plans, discussions about the family fortune, the upcoming will reading, and an ominous mention of disposing of the problem. The sinister undertones of these conversations sent a chill down her spine. Elizabeth's worst fears were beginning to take shape in her mind, and she realized that the elderly woman she had grown so close to was in grave danger. Despite the mounting dread, Elizabeth kept her focus on caring for Mrs. Foster. She administered the medications with precision, adjusted the pillows beneath her patient's frail body, and stayed by her side as the days blurred together. But each passing moment felt like a countdown. Veronica was more determined than ever to take control of her mother's assets. And Elizabeth was now certain that her role in the family's drama was far more sinister than anyone had imagined. It was during one of those quiet moments when Elizabeth noticed something strange. The medications had once again been tampered with. Her heart raced as she examined the bottles on the bedside table. It wasn't just that they had been rearranged, they had been replaced with new, unfamiliar pills. Elizabeth's medical training kicked in immediately, and she knew that the change was no mistake. Someone, most likely Veronica, was intentionally altering the dosage, pushing her mother's health to the brink. Elizabeth's resolve hardened. She knew she had to act, but she also knew that she was walking a dangerous path. She could no longer stand idly by while Veronica's greed threatened to destroy the woman she had come to love like a mother. She had to expose the conspiracy. But how? The tension in the mansion was palpable. Elizabeth began to notice the subtle signs of unease in the other staff members. The once friendly atmosphere had shifted. The housekeeper spoke in hushed tones, and the butler's smile had become strained. Even the gardeners, who had always greeted her with friendly nods, now avoided her gaze. Everyone was on edge, but no one dared to speak up. It was as though Veronica's power had extended beyond the walls of her family home and had infected every corner of the mansion. One evening, Elizabeth was summoned to the kitchen for a cup of tea. It was there that she overheard more details of Veronica's plan. Though the conversation was intended to be a whisper between her and the same man who had been visiting her mother, everything is falling into place. Veronica's voice hissed, barely audible but unmistakable in its venom. Once my mother's gone, I'll have full control. The will is already changed. All that's left is to finish this. The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Veronica was planning her mother's death, and Elizabeth could no longer ignore the truth that had been steadily growing in the back of her mind. She was an accomplice in this cruel scheme, a puppet master pulling strings from behind the scenes, using her mother's deteriorating health as a pawn in a deadly game. Elizabeth's instincts screamed at her to confront Veronica, but she knew that doing so would only make her a target. She had to be careful. One wrong move, and she might be implicated in a crime she didn't commit. The stakes were too high. Mrs. Foster was not just an elderly woman who needed care. She was a key to a much larger puzzle. Elizabeth's task now was to protect her, expose the plot, and, above all, stay alive. That night, as she prepared the final dose of medication for Mrs. Foster, Elizabeth's mind raced with thoughts of what she had learned. The walls of the mansion, once filled with warmth and quiet conversations, now felt suffocating. There was no escape from the danger lurking within these walls. The house that had once been a refuge was now a prison. With Veronica as its warden, Elizabeth's determination grew stronger. But she knew that she needed proof, something irrefutable that would expose the truth. It was then that a faint noise in the hallway caught her attention. Someone was moving in the dark, speaking in hushed tones. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat as she silently approached the door, pressing her ear against the wood. The voices grew clearer. I'm telling you, Veronica, it has to be done tonight. We can't wait any longer. The man's voice growled. Don't worry, Veronica replied coolly. It's all taken care of. The will is changed, and no one will suspect a thing. My mother's health has already deteriorated enough that no one will question it. Elizabeth's stomach turned. It was worse than she had imagined. This was not just about inheritance. It was about murder. Plain and simple. Veronica was willing to kill her own mother for money, and she had already set everything in motion. The next morning, Elizabeth's suspicion was confirmed when Mrs. Foster's condition worsened dramatically. The frail woman, once so full of life, was now a shadow of herself. Her breathing was shallow, her skin clammy, and her eyes flickered with confusion. Elizabeth's heart sank as she realized that the manipulation of Mrs. Foster's medications had taken its toll. Desperation fueled her actions as she prepared to call for help. But when she reached for the phone, she hesitated. Veronica would never allow the truth to come to light. She had too much to lose. Elizabeth knew that exposing the plot now would mean not only losing her job, but potentially her freedom. Veronica had too many connections, too much influence. Still, Elizabeth knew she couldn't just stand by and watch this woman die for no reason other than greed. She had to protect Mrs. Foster, even if it meant facing the wrath of the woman who had orchestrated everything. As Elizabeth stood at the edge of the precipice, she realized that her world had shifted. She was no longer just a nurse. She had become a witness to something much darker. And now it was her responsibility to make sure that the truth came to light. But how? How could she expose a conspiracy so deeply entrenched in wealth and power without being destroyed in the process. The answer, she realized, lay in patience. She would bide her time, observe the smallest details, and gather the proof she needed. One way or another, she would bring the truth to the surface. The consequences be damned. As the days wore on, Elizabeth's resolve hardened, and with it, her understanding of the danger she was in. The mansion, once a sanctuary of kindness, now felt like a battleground. Veronica's sinister manipulations were growing more calculated by the hour, and Elizabeth's fear for Mrs. Foster deepened with each passing moment. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of unsaid words and unspoken threats. Every night, as Elizabeth sat by Mrs. Foster's bedside, she wondered if this would be the night she lost her. The illness had taken its toll on Mrs. Foster. Her once vibrant spirit was fading, and her body was succumbing to the poison that Veronica had carefully administered. Elizabeth had watched it all happen, powerless to intervene, and it felt like a cruel irony. Here she was, someone trained to heal, and yet she could do nothing but watch as the woman she cared for slipped further away. On one particularly grim night, Elizabeth's vigilance paid off. She had stayed up late, watching Mrs. Foster sleep fitfully, her shallow breaths filling the room with an eerie sense of impending loss. As the clock struck midnight, Elizabeth heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the door. She froze. Veronica had been more careful lately, but Elizabeth knew that if anyone had the audacity to enter now, it was her. When Veronica entered the room, she did not acknowledge Elizabeth, her eyes fixed on her mother's frail form. For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with the weight of their shared history. But Elizabeth's trained eyes were sharp, and she noticed the subtle gesture, the swift movement of Veronica's hand as she reached toward the bedside table, where the medication bottles lay. Without thinking, Elizabeth rose and quietly approached the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to stop Veronica before it was too late. As she reached for the handle, a noise stopped her. Veronica's voice, a low murmur, as she spoke to herself in a tone that sent a shiver down Elizabeth's spine. "I'll have it all. No one will stop me this time. Not even you, Mother." The words struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. She had known for some time that Veronica was capable of terrible things, but hearing her say them out loud felt like a betrayal, a final confirmation of everything Elizabeth had feared. The woman she had trusted, who had appeared to care for her mother, was nothing more than a cold-hearted opportunist, willing to do whatever it took to secure her own future. Elizabeth felt a surge of emotion, rage, sorrow, and determination rush through her. She had no choice now. She couldn't remain silent, not when the stakes were this high. She had to protect Mrs. Foster, even if it meant risking everything. She quickly stepped back from the door, making her way to the phone in the hallway. There was no time to waste. Veronica was about to finish what she had started, and Elizabeth needed to stop her. She dialed the number for the local authorities, her voice trembling but determined as she explained the situation, urging them to act fast. The phone call felt like an eternity. As she hung up, Elizabeth returned to Mrs. Foster's room, her mind racing with the realization that the woman she had once trusted had just crossed a line from which there was no return. She knew now that she had to expose Veronica's true nature, but she also knew that doing so would be dangerous. Veronica would stop at nothing to protect herself. Elizabeth's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Mrs. Foster stirring. She approached the bed, taking the elderly woman's hand in her own, trying to reassure her with a soft voice. "Don't worry, Mrs. Foster. I'm here. I won't let her hurt you." It was at that moment that Elizabeth knew she had made a decision. She would confront Veronica, no matter the cost. The darkness in Veronica's heart had to be brought to light, and Elizabeth was the one who would do it. She would gather the evidence, expose the plot, and make sure that justice was served, even if it meant putting her own life on the line. As the hours passed, Elizabeth watched over Mrs. Foster, praying that the authorities would arrive in time to prevent any further harm. She knew she had done all she could to protect her, but the fight was far from over. There was still the matter of the will, the conspiracy, and Veronica's twisted plan. And there was still the question of how far Veronica would go to make sure her mother's death went unnoticed. How far she would go to keep the truth buried. The nights stretched on, each minute feeling like a weight pressing down on Elizabeth's chest. She sat at Mrs. Foster's side, determined to be the one to expose the truth. Veronica might have thought she could manipulate the situation in her favor, but Elizabeth was not going to let that happen. And then, as dawn broke over the horizon, the first glimmer of hope arrived. Sirens could be heard approaching in the distance. Elizabeth's heart leapt in her chest. The authorities were here. But as the sound of approaching footsteps filled the hallway, she realized with a sudden clarity that this was only the beginning. Veronica was about to make her final move, and Elizabeth had to stop her before it was too late. In the unfolding story, each character reveals a profound lesson about human nature, integrity, and the cost of ambition. Elizabeth, the dedicated nurse, embodies selflessness and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Her unwavering commitment to Mrs. Foster, even at the risk of her own safety, teaches us the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the truth is hard to uncover. Her actions emphasize that the fight for justice is not only about confronting external forces, but also about overcoming the internal battles of fear, doubt, and loneliness. Elizabeth's journey shows that in the face of corruption and betrayal, we must remain steadfast in our belief in the truth, even when it seems like we are standing alone. Veronica, on the other hand, represents the destructive nature of greed and selfishness. Her manipulation and eventual cruelty towards her own mother highlight how the desire for power can lead people to lose their humanity. Veronica's character reveals the danger of letting ambition overshadow compassion, ultimately costing her the love and trust of those around her. Her actions teach us that the pursuit of wealth and control comes at the price of integrity. And in the end, it is always the truth that prevails. Mrs. Foster, though not actively involved in the conflict, symbolizes the fragility of life and the vulnerability that comes with age. Her quiet suffering and ultimate trust in Elizabeth serve as a reminder that love and trust are invaluable. Mrs. Foster's character underscores the importance of nurturing relationships and shows us that the true legacy of a person lies not in wealth or status, but in the lives they touch and the hearts they leave behind. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. We hope you found inspiration in Elizabeth's fight for justice and the lessons it teaches us about integrity, love, and resilience. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Empathy Stories for more powerful narratives. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth.